When I bought my property, the airstrip was already there. It had been used for years by local pilots, and HOA started building houses around it. At first, I assumed they had checked every required record.
Within months, the construction crews had surrounded two sides of the runway. The houses were getting closer with every week. I checked my property survey again and again. The runway itself was still entirely on my land. Then Victoria Hayes showed up at my runway. She said the HOA had concerns about unsafe private aviation activity. I asked her why they had approved homes beside an active airstrip. She told me I needed to stop using the runway. I asked her to show me the rule that prohibited my flights. She opened her folder and produced HOA documents. None of them changed the ownership of my runway. That was when I decided to check the aviation records myself. That evening, I spread every document across my desk. The original property records showed the runway clearly. Old aerial maps showed it had existed long before the HOA development. The more I researched, the more suspicious the construction became. I started documenting everything around the runway. I measured distances and photographed every nearby construction site. I recorded where each house was being placed. I wanted facts instead of arguments. Victoria insisted the development had already passed the HOA's internal review. She claimed the runway was an inconvenience to the new homeowners. But an HOA approval was not the same thing as an aviation approval. I knew someone independent needed to inspect the situation. I contacted the appropriate aviation authorities and submitted my documentation. I explained that new homes were being constructed around an established runway. I didn't accuse anyone of breaking rules. I simply asked for an independent review. A few days later, an inspector arrived at the property. He introduced himself as Daniel Brooks and explained that he was there to review the airstrip. I handed him the documents I had collected. Then we walked toward the runway together. Daniel examined the runway, surrounding structures and property boundaries. He compared the physical layout with the records I provided. He asked several questions about when the houses were approved. Victoria suddenly became much quieter. The inspector studied the runway layout for nearly an hour. He kept comparing his observations with the official records. Then he asked Victoria, who had reviewed the development's proximity to the airstrip. She couldn't immediately provide an answer. Daniel discovered something important in the development plans. Several homes had been positioned much closer to the runway than the original layout showed. The problem wasn't my runway. It was how the new development had been designed around it. Victoria argued that the HOA had already spent millions on construction. She demanded that the runway operations be restricted instead. Daniel listened without arguing. Then he asked her for the approvals supporting that demand. Daniel went through the records one document at a time. He checked the runway history, property boundaries, and development plans. The paperwork told a very different story from Victoria's claims. The HOA had built first and asked questions later. Daniel finally explained that the development needed to address the aviation concerns. He made it clear that my private ownership did not simply disappear because new homes were being built. Victoria looked stunned. Her entire argument had just changed direction. The development was ordered to address the issues identified during the review. Construction plans suddenly had to be reconsidered. The HOA could no longer pretend the runway didn't exist. For the first time, the burden was on them to fix the situation. Daniel handed me copies of the inspection records. He told me my documentation had made the review much easier. I thanked him and looked down the runway. For the first time in months, I felt like my property was finally being heard. The development plans were revised after the inspection. Some construction areas had to be redesigned around the established airstrip. The runway remained where it had always been. The difference was that everyone finally respected the existing layout. Months earlier, the HOA thought they could simply build around me. They assumed I would eventually give up and close the runway. Instead, the records forced everyone to look at the facts. I never needed to shout. I just needed proof. The HOA wanted my runway gone because it didn't fit their plans. But the airstrip existed before their neighborhood ever did. When the inspector arrived, the records finally spoke for themselves. And sometimes, the strongest defense is simply proving what was there first.